Lonely rancher was just buying a cow until the child whispered, "It's my mommy's last day alive." Wyoming spring of 1890. The town of Frontier Ridge boiled beneath the surface. Its soil had cracked from drought, its cattle herds thinned by thieves who struck under moonless skies. Hunger stalked the streets not only in bellies, but in tempers. The people had grown brittle like dry timber waiting for a spark. And there, in the center of town, that spark waited on a scaffold. The courthouse steps, once a place for law and judgment, had been repurposed into gallows. The rope swung loose, creaking faintly in the morning wind. Atop the platform stood a woman, wrists, chained iron collar biting into her skin. Her dress was torn, her arms and face marked by bruises shaped like fingers that had never known mercy. The crowd pressed close, a murmur of voices rising with the dust. Some demanded justice. Others demanded blood. Few cared about the difference anymore. Into this scene walked Jed Walker. He came not with a cause nor with a mission, just a rancher who no longer had a ranch to tend a man hollowed out by grief. 3 winters ago, fever had taken both his wife and daughter in the same week. Since then, Jed had spoken mostly to his boots and trusted no man beyond the fence posts. His eyes, once bright with youth and fight, now carried the dull ache of someone who had lost every reason to care. All he wanted this morning was a cow, a trade, a transaction without memory. But in Frontier Ridge, even silence had a way of dragging you into trouble. He felt the first tug before he even saw the hand. Thin fingers clutched the hem of his duster. Jed looked down. A girl no older than 5 stood barefoot in the mud. Her cheeks were smudged with soot. Her dress hung loose, and in her arms she clutched a wooden gourd like it was treasure. Her eyes, too big for her small face, stared up at him with desperate honesty. "It's my mommy's last day alive," she whispered. "Please help." Jed froze. For a moment, all he could see were the eyes of his own daughter, the ones he had watched dim under fever years ago. The crowd's shouts blurred, the scaffold's creak faded, and only that child's trembling voice remained. He looked back toward the platform. The woman lifted her gaze just once, and though her face was battered, her jaw set, her eyes carried a kind of defiance that unsettled him. In that instant, Jed's heart buckled. Before we ride deeper into this story, I want to pause and ask you something simple. Where are you watching from tonight? A quiet town, a busy city, or maybe somewhere with wide open skies like Frontier Ridge? Share it below, because these old frontier tales reach further when we know who's gathered around the fire with us. The rope swayed above the crowd, ready to claim another body before noon. Jed Walker turned toward his horse. He had come only for a cow, but now the ghosts of his past and the plea of a child were pulling him into something far more dangerous. Jed Walker stood rooted in the dust, the echo of that whisper ringing louder in his ears than the jeers of the crowd or the creak of the scaffold. The girl's hand still clutched at his coat, trembling yet stubborn. Her voice had been small, but the weight of it struck harder than any gunshot. "It's my mommy's last day alive." Jed's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, he wanted to turn away. He had told himself for years he was done interfering in the business of others. Too many times he had reached out only to be left with loss. A man could only bury so much before he learned to stop digging. But those eyes, those wide, desperate eyes, broke through the walls he had built. They were too much like his daughter's eyes on the night fever took her. Eyes that had begged him to stay awake, to keep watch, to not let go. Eyes that still haunted his sleep. He looked up again at the scaffold. The woman's head was bowed, but something in her posture caught him. She wasn't begging for mercy, not even trying to cry out her innocence. Her silence was not weakness. It was armor. the kind forged by someone who knew that dignity was the only thing they couldn't take from her. And then he felt it, the old ache he had buried under years of dust and silence. The ache of a man who once believed he could protect and failed. Sometimes it isn't the roar of a mob that changes a man's path. It's the whisper of a child who refuses to let her mother die unheard. Jed pulled free from the girl's grip, but not to leave. His boots carried him through the crowd, every step heavier than the last. People shifted aside, muttering. Some scoffed, others sneered. At the sheriff's desk, the deputy glanced up, surprised, as Jed reached into his saddlebag. Out came a worn leather wallet, cracked from years of weather. Inside it, a tarnished badge, a silver star, dulled by rust. He slapped it on the desk, his voice dry as the prairie wind. Jed Walker. I'm invoking Section 7. That woman is now a protected witness. The scaffold comes down. The deputy blinked, uncertain. The sheriff was out of town, no judge had ruled, and no one present could overrule the badge Jed now claimed. The rope was untied. The crowd groaned, but none moved to stop it. The woman stumbled off the platform, barely catching herself, before the girl, Lily, ran into her arms. Jed turned away without waiting for thanks. His voice was low, almost like gravel. You've got 24 hours, Miss Hayes. Stay alive long enough to prove you're worth it. He mounted his horse, the crowd parting before him like grass before a storm. Behind him, Lily clutched her mother's hand and whispered almost in wonder. He looks like he forgot how to smile, Mama. Maybe we can help him remember. And with that, the gallows stood empty, and the town of Frontier Ridge held its breath. The silver star still lay on the sheriff's desk, its edges dulled its shine, long since eaten away by rust. Most men in that crowd had forgotten it existed. Some were too young to even know what it meant. But Jed Walker hadn't forgotten. That badge had once hung on his chest when he rode border duty during the conflicts, back when law meant little more than who dared to stand tallest with a rifle. It was never about honor. Not then. Not now. But it was enough to halt a hanging, enough to buy time. As Jed rode out of the square, whispers chased his horse like dust on the wind. Walker's gone soft. He's harboring a killer. Others muttered darker things, curses half hidden beneath breath. But not one of them had stepped forward when the rope hung ready. Not one had dared question the rush to hang a woman without a trial. That was the difference. Jed's defiance wasn't born of certainty. He didn't know if Maria Hayes was guilty or innocent. He only knew the town was hungry, and a noose was easier to feed than the truth. Behind him in the rattling wagon borrowed from the blacksmith, Maria sat hunched with her daughter pressed against her sit-so-so-and. She hadn't thanked him. She hadn't even spoken his name. But when Jed glanced over his shoulder, he caught her staring at the badge tucked back into his coat. Her eyes flickered not with trust, not yet, but with the faintest glimmer of something he recognized. Hope thin as a candle in the wind. Sometimes it isn't the shine of a badge that stops a hanging, it's the man behind it choosing to wear the weight of justice one more time. The road out of Frontier Ridge was rough, winding through brittle brush and patches of old snow. Jed rode ahead, reins loose in his hands, his face unreadable. Every so often his gaze shifted back to the wagon, not to Maria, but to Lily. The child sat curled beneath his coat, far too small for the world that had already demanded so much of her. Jed's jaw tightened. He remembered burying his own little girl in frozen soil 3 winters ago. Remembered how small the coffin had looked against the wide Wyoming sky. He had sworn never to let anyone close again, never to feel that kind of breaking twice. And yet here he was, leading 2 strangers away from the gallows, the badge in his pocket, pulling him back into a fight he thought he'd left buried. Maria's voice finally broke the silence. He said, "I'd never leave that scaffold alive." Jed didn't turn, but something in his shoulders stiffened. Her words came in fragments, as though each memory cost her breath. "I was bringing Lily home. That man, he smelled of rot gut, grabbed me by the hair. I pushed back, screamed, then black. Just black. When I woke, he was dead. And they said it was me." Jed said nothing, but his hand tightened on the reins until the leather bit into his palm. The sun dipped low shadows stretching long across the plain. Behind them, the gallows of Frontier Ridge still stood empty for now. Ahead lay only hard questions and harder answers. The wagon creaked as it rolled over frozen ruts, every turn of the wheel echoing the weight of words Maria hadn't yet spoken. She sat hunched, arms around Lily, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if the dirt itself might accuse her. The air between her and Jed was thick, filled with unasked questions and truths too jagged to release. Her voice, when it finally came, was brittle, the sound of driftwood cracked by waves. "Each morning I was given tea, said it was a kindness, from the mayor himself. At first I believed it. Who wouldn't?" Jed didn't look back, but his brow furrowed beneath the brim of his hat. And then he asked. Maria's hands trembled as she stroked Lily's hair. "Then I began to forget. Names at first. Days. My hands would shake so bad I could barely hold a needle. Some mornings I could hardly stand, and they said it was weakness. Said it was proof I wasn't fit to raise my child. Every bruise became a story they wrote for me. And when that man was found dead, the town was ready to believe their story, not mine." Her words fell apart in the cold air. She looked down at her wrists, the skin raw where chains had bitten deep. Her silence returned, but now it was clear it wasn't the silence of guilt. It was the silence of someone who had learned that speaking only gave men more to twist against her. Sometimes the heaviest chains aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones that turn your own voice into a weapon used against you. Jed kept his eyes on the horizon, but his jaw clenched hard enough to ache. He had seen enough lies in his time to know the shape of one. And Maria's story, ragged as it was carried the ring of truth louder than the shouts of the crowd that wanted her swinging. Behind him, Lily shifted in her mother's arms, half asleep, half listening. Maria smoothed the girl's hair, whispering so faint Jed barely caught it. "She doesn't know everything. She only knows I tried to keep her safe." For the first time since leaving the gallows, Jed slowed his horse. He glanced back at the wagon, his eyes meeting Maria's for just a moment. "Then that's all she needs to know," he said gruffly. "For now." Maria blinked, startled by the faintest thread of mercy in his tone. She nodded once, her throat too tight for words. The wagon creaked on, carrying them away from the town that had branded her guilty before asking a single question. But Jed Walker knew the questions had only just begun. By the time Jed's wagon creaked up the ridge toward his ranch, the word had already spread like prairie fire. Folks from town trailed behind him on horseback. Voices, hard faces, harder. Men with pistols at their sides. Women with arms folded tight, all of them burning for someone to blame. Maria clutched Lily against her, her body trembling though she tried to hide it. Jed felt the weight of their eyes boring into his back, not just suspicion, but fury. He had seen this look before in war, in towns hungry for blood when reason had dried up like the rivers in drought. He reined in his horse, the wagon halting in the chill dusk. Dust swirled at his boots as he climbed down, coat flapping in the wind. 20 men and women stood there waiting for him to hand the woman over to let the noose finish what it had started. Jed's gaze swept the crowd. He recognized their faces, men who once fought beside him, women who once brought bread after his wife died. But grief changes people. Fear poisons them quicker than whiskey. A voice shouted from the back, "Walker's gone soft. He's harboring a killer." Another jeered, "That woman's got death in her eyes. Best hang her 'fore she takes more of us." Jed didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he walked to the wagon and knelt beside Lily. She sat shivering, clutching the corner of his coat, like it was the only anchor left in the storm. Slowly, Jed shrugged out of the coat lined with wool, patched and worn from years, and wrapped it around the child's shoulders. He buttoned it beneath her chin with a tenderness so at odds with the steel in his eyes that the crowd fell to a hush. Then he turned, standing square before them. His voice was even low, but it carried across the ridge. "Ride tonight, if you must. But know this, I've buried one child already. I'll bury myself before I let another hang." The words dropped heavy into the silence like stones into deep water. Maria's breath hitched behind him. Lily's small fingers tightened around the coat. And the crowd. They shifted. Some glared, some spat, but none moved forward, because they all knew Jed Walker's grief was no bluff. Sometimes it isn't bullets that turn a crowd. It's the voice of a man who's already lost everything once and refuses to lose it again. Jed stepped back to the wagon, offered Maria his hand, and helped her down. She was unsteady, eyes wide with disbelief, but when his rough palm closed around hers, she held on. He guided her and Lily toward the cabin, small and patched with tin, but warm. "It's not a jail," he said flatly, opening the door. "But don't take me for a fool." Maria nodded faintly. "I won't." Inside, the fire glowed low. Jed laid Lily on the cot in the corner, tucking her beneath his coat. For a moment his hand lingered at her forehead, brushing the hair back as he used to with his own daughter. Then he pulled away, his face unreadable, but his chest heavy with something he had thought long buried. Maria stood in the doorway, tears clinging to her lashes. "Why? Why are you helping us?" she asked, voice cracking. Jed stared at the flames, his voice gravel. "Because someone once helped me back before I forgot how to believe in people." Outside, the crowd dispersed slowly, their whispers carried on the wind. Inside, the silence was not comfort, but it wasn't cruelty either. For now, that was enough. If you felt the weight of Jed's vow protecting a child, even against an entire town, then comment 1. But if you believe he was wrong to stand alone, comment 0. I'd like to know where your heart stands. The cabin fire burned low when Jed pulled his coat back from Lily's shoulders and slipped out into the night. He hadn't said where he was going, but Maria knew. She watched from the doorway, pale and trembling, as the man who had once promised only to buy a cow now carried her fate in the set of his jaw. The trail to Willow Creek was half buried, the snow crusted hard under the moonlight. Jed rode slow, the horse's breath steaming in the dark. His eyes scanned every bend, every patch of dirt where truth might still cling. Maria's words haunted him. I woke up, and he was gone. Just gone. At the creek's edge, he dismounted. The place was too clean. No blood, no scuffle, no sign of death, though a man was said to have bled out here. Jed crouched, his gloved fingers sifting through the churned mud. The earth told stories even when men tried to erase them. And this story smelled of rot. Then he remembered Lily's whisper earlier that day. The bad man had a snake on his belt. Jed's gaze snapped to a gnarled root half buried in ice. Something glinted there, dull brass under moss. He dug it free. A belt buckle worn, cracked but unmistakable, a coiled rattlesnake stamped deep into the leather. Jed knew it instantly. Only one man in Frontier Ridge wore snakehide like this. Mayor Charles Harper, the same man who had poured Maria's tea with a smile and called it kindness, the same man who had urged the crowd to hang her before noon. Jed turned the buckle in his hand, his breath white against the night air. This was no accident. It was a trap, and Maria had been the easiest one to bind in its teeth. Sometimes the ground itself holds the truth, waiting for the one man stubborn enough to kneel in the snow and listen. He slipped the belt into his coat, mounted up, and rode back through the trees. The wind cut sharp, but his mind burned hotter. He had proof now, not enough to clear Maria yet, but enough to crack the lie wide open. Back at the cabin, Maria lay curled on the cot, Lily tucked against her side. Her skin was pale, her breath shallow. The tea, Jed thought grimly. The poison was still in her veins. He set the belt on the table, the rattlesnake gleaming faintly in the firelight. Maria's eyes fluttered open, following the shape. She gasped, hand flying to her mouth. Jed nodded once, his voice low. "We've got our snake. Now we need to cut off its head." Maria's skin was pale as candle wax when Jed returned from the creek, the rattlesnake belt heavy in his coat pocket. She lay curled on the cot, her lips tinged blue, her breath shallow and rasping. Lily pressed against her side, clutching her mother's hand with a child's desperate grip. Jed crouched beside them, his rough palm brushing Maria's forehead. It burned with fever, not the fever of sickness, but the kind born of something deeper, darker. He reached for the teacup she had brought from town, still faint with residue at the bottom. Jed lifted it to his nose, inhaled and grimaced. Bitter. Wrong. He looked at Maria, his voice low but steady. "How long have you been drinking this?" Her eyelids fluttered. "Weeks. Maybe more. I thought it was just nerves. Said it would help me sleep." Jed's jaw tightened. Murder wearing patience. Whoever had given her that tea wasn't healing her. They were bleeding her out, slowly hiding poison in kindness. Without another word, Jed scooped Maria into his arms. Her weight was too light, her frame trembling against his chest. He motioned for Lily. "Climb in the wagon, little one. Hold tight." Snow whipped at their faces as the horses carried them through the night toward the edge of town, where Doc Ellis's cabin stood with a single lantern glowing. The old doctor blinked awake when Jed pounded at his door, his wiry frame stiff as he stepped aside. Jed carried Maria in and laid her gently across the examination table. "Poison," Jed said simply. "Slow kind." Ellis's hands moved fast despite his age. He checked her pulse, pried open, her eyelids held a lantern close to study her pupils. Then he lifted the cup Jed had brought and sniffed the residue. His face darkened. "Yarrow mixed with nightshade," he muttered. "Not enough to kill quick, but enough to weaken her until she couldn't fight back." A cruel thing. Whoever gave her this meant for her to break piece by piece. Maria's eyes fluttered open, glassy but aware. "I thought it was kindness." Doc Ellis shook his head grimly. "Kindness doesn't come in poison, Mrs. Hayes. This was murder wrapped in patience." Jed stood silent, his fists clenched so tight the leather of his gloves creaked. For years he had let the world pass him by, convinced he was done with saving anyone. But here lay proof, not just in brass or leather, but in a woman's body marked by cruelty disguised as care. Sometimes the deadliest weapons aren't guns or knives, but cups of tea offered with a smile. The doctor worked quickly, mixing a tonic, forcing drops between Maria's lips until the tremors eased just slightly. Lily clung to her mother's arm, her small voice whispering, "Don't leave me, Mama." Maria turned her head weakly, her breath brushing her daughter's hair. Jed placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. His voice was rough, but steady. "She's not leaving. Not if I've got anything to say about it." When Doc Ellis finally straightened, wiping his hands, he nodded toward Jed. "This will buy her time, but it won't fix what's broken in this town. You'll need more than medicine. You'll need truth." Jed pulled the snake-hide belt from his coat and set it beside the teacup. The firelight caught the coiled emblem gleaming like a serpent ready to strike. Ellis's eyes narrowed, recognition dawning. Jed's voice was low, almost a growl. "We've got the poison. We've got the snake. Now it's time to drag both into the light." The storm outside thickened, but inside that small cabin, a different kind of storm had begun, one that would not stop until justice was forced to stand tall. Dawn had not yet broken when Jed hitched the wagon outside Doc Ellis's cabin. The snow fell heavier now, flakes thick as feathers covering the land in silence. Maria was wrapped in wool pale but breathing steadier under the doctor's tonic. Lily sat beside her, small hands fidgeting with the frayed ribbon in her doll's hair. Jed checked his rifle, the snake-hide belt, and the poisoned teacup tucked safely in his coat. The truth was finally in his hands, but truth, he knew, had a way of drawing bullets before it ever saw daylight. The road through Gray Rock Bluff wound narrow and treacherous. Pines pressed in close on both sides, their limbs heavy with snow. The horses snorted uneasily, hooves crunching slow. Jed's eyes swept the ridges, every instinct in him screaming caution. It came with the crack of a rifle. The first shot split the stillness, sparking the air past his shoulder. The horses screamed and reared, the wagon tilting dangerously on the frozen path. Maria gasped, clutching Lily tight. Jed barked down and dove from the seat, dragging his rifle free. Two men stepped from the trees, coats dark, rifles raised. Their faces were shadowed by wide brims, but Jed knew them. Harper's men. The mayor's patience had run out. "Hand the woman over, Walker," one called. "She ain't worth dying for." Jed stood tall in the snow, his breath steaming, rifle steady. "She's under my protection." The other man sneered. "Not anymore." A second shot cracked. One of Jed's horses dropped collapsing into the snow. Jed fired back the bullet, kicking bark off the pine just inches from the man's boots. "Next one lands in your chest," Jed said coldly. The men faltered, rifles wavering. They hadn't expected him to stand so firm, not against two barrels pointed his way. But Jed Walker was done watching innocents strung up without a fight. He had already buried his family once. He wasn't about to bury another. The attackers exchanged a look, then melted back into the trees, regrouping. Jed didn't wait. He moved fast, hauling Maria onto his back, her weak frame trembling against him. "Lily, hold on to my belt." "Don't let go no matter what." Snow churned under their boots as they abandoned the crippled wagon and pushed through the thicket. Hour after hour, Jed drove them forward, his legs burning breath-ragged clouds in the frozen air. The slope grew steeper, the pines closing like an iron wall, but he didn't slow. Maria coughed against his shoulder, her voice a rasp. "Jed, leave me. Save her." "Don't talk," he growled. "Just breathe." Lily stumbled once, twice, her cheeks red with cold. Jed caught her hand, gripping it in his gloved fist. "I lost one little girl to fever," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I ain't losing another to rope and lies." There are moments when a man doesn't get to choose the fight, only whether he stands in it or falls with the ones he swore to protect. At last a dim glow flickered through the snow ahead, a chapel carved into the mountainside, half forgotten, but still standing. Reverend Isaac's Refuge. Jed pressed forward, pounding on the door until it creaked open. The old preacher's eyes widened at the sight. A weary rancher, a dying woman, and a child clinging to both. Jed's voice was low, steady, not the devil chasing us. Just men pretending they're God. The preacher stepped aside, letting them in. The storm howled outside, but within those walls the fire caught, and the first threads of sanctuary held. By noon, the square of Frontier Ridge was heavy with whispers. The gallows still waited on the courthouse steps, its rope swaying like a reminder of what the town nearly did. But today, Jed Walker did not come alone. He rode in with Maria, pale but standing, Lily clutching her hand, Reverend Isaac at one side, and Doc Ellis at the other. The crowd stirred, uncertain. Some spat, some muttered, but none stopped him as Jed strode into the meeting hall. He carried no rifle in his hands, only truth. The councilman sat stiff, the mayor's chair conspicuously empty. Harper had vanished, but his presence lingered like smoke after a fire. Jed stepped forward and set his evidence on the table: the rattlesnake belt, the stained teacup, the doctor's report, the preacher's sworn testimony. His voice was low but steady. This is the truth. A woman poisoned until she could barely stand. A man too proud of his snake to hide its skin. And a town too quick to hang her before asking a single question. Doc Ellis spoke next, his words clipped but certain. Nightshade. Weeks of it. Someone meant for her to fail slowly so blame would fall easy. Reverend Isaac laid a trembling hand on his Bible. She came to me afraid, whispering of herbs in her tea. I told her God still listens even when men do not. Today you must listen too. The council murmured, some wavering, others clinging to anger. One demanded proof Harper himself was guilty. Jed raised the belt high. This buckle was found at Willow Creek, buried where they thought snow could keep it hidden. Tell me whose hand it came from, if not Harper's. The hall fell into silence. Then a woman in the back stood, her voice breaking. I knew her. She was kind when I worked in Harper's house. And I remember the bruises. I remember the tea. The gavel struck. The charges against Maria Hayes are dropped. The gallows will be dismantled by dusk. A warrant will be issued for Charles Harper. Justice doesn't always arrive with cheers. Sometimes it comes in silence when a rope is lowered and the truth is no longer ignored. Maria wept, Lily's arms wrapped tight around her. Jed walked them out into the sunlight. And for the first time in years, he let the corners of his mouth bend into something close to a smile. The gallows still stood, but its noose was empty. By dusk, it would be firewood, and with it Frontier Ridge's hunger for blood would burn with the lies that fed it. By dusk, the scaffold was nothing more than planks and rope piled in the square. Neighbors turned away from it, as if ashamed, but for Jed, Maria, and Lily, the real trial had ended the moment the gavel fell. Back at Jed's modest ranch, the house no longer felt hollow. Maria stood at the stove, her movements slow but steady, filling the room with the smell of bread. Lily sat on the floor with chalk, scratching crooked letters across scraps of wood. Her laughter carried through the cabin, bright and unbroken, as though she had forgotten what fear felt like. Jed watched them quietly. He had spent years sharpening tools, patching fences, speaking mostly to his boots. But now the sound of a child reading letters allowed the warmth of a woman humming as she cooked. Elah's the silence with something he had once believed gone forever. One evening, Lily toddled over to him with a scrap of paper in her hands. Drawn in clumsy strokes were 3 figures standing on a hill, one tall one with long hair, and one small with arms outstretched like wings. At the bottom, she had scrawled in shaky letters, "We found the home you lost." Jed's breath caught. His knees nearly buckled as he pulled the child into his arms. Maria stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her lips, eyes shining with tears. For the first time, Jed did not see ghosts in the firelight, only family. Jed placed the drawing on the mantel beside the faded photograph of the family he had buried, and the new one of the family he had saved. And in that small act, grief finally gave way to grace. The story of Jed, Maria, and Lily was no longer about loss. It was about return, about a man who thought he had nothing left, and a woman and child who showed him he still had everything worth fighting for. Now I'd like to ask you if you were Jed, broken by grief and afraid to love again. Would you have opened your door to Maria and Lily, or would you have turned away? Share your answer in the comments. Because sometimes the stories we tell here remind us of the choices still waiting in our own lives.